Welcome back to Down the Middle. Today we have with us our third guest in a very long, drawn-out series to help understand the plumbing of the financial system, the interaction between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, where we are in the economic cycle, and where we're headed in terms of dollar funding, which has obviously become so much more important with the situation in Russia and Ukraine because it's cast a light on it. So we have with us today David Beckworth. He is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. What's interesting to me, former international economist at the U.S. Department of Treasury. So I don't normally speak with former Treasury officials. I speak with a lot more Fed officials. And he's the author of Boom and Bust Banking, The Causes and Cures of the Great Recession, which is something we can talk about.
Sure.
But first, let's do what we always do on Down the Middle. Welcome, and let's find out who you are. So it's great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
David, walk us through the path that took you to where you are, your influences, where you grew up, who inspired you, mentors, your studies, what your takeaways were as you were growing up that put you on the path that led you to where you are today.
Okay, well, we could do a whole show on that, I'm sure, but we'll keep this short. So my parents were actually missionaries in Africa for a number of years, and I was a young person then, and I think that really sparked my curiosity because then I came back to the States and I saw this stark difference between how people lived in Africa and how they lived in the U.S. And as an elementary school kid, I was asking the question, why? Why is it so different? And, you know, like most American kids, I got caught up in things of life, sports, popular culture. But in the back of my mind, that question was always lurking, and I was thinking about it. And then in college, I finally took some economics courses that, for me, provided a systematic framework for thinking about those issues, which I had never seen before. And although my initial interest was more on the development side of economics, I took macroeconomics, the principles, the first course, and it really sparked my interest. And I wasn't an economics major at the time, but I really loved it. And it never dawned on me that you could actually be an economist as a career. This wasn't on my radar.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that.
Yeah,
I speak to too many economists.
Well, it just, I came from a world where, those type of career options just weren't on anyone's radar. So in any event, I got my undergraduate degree, and then I went to work on an MBA, and I had to take some more economics classes.
Of course.
And then it clicked. I was like, and I love that as a college student. Let me take some now. And finally, I went on to get a PhD. But things that kind of helped click and really crystallize that interest, I hate to say this, but there were several people during this time I was reading, this was in the mid to late 90s, who made me even more interested in it. One was Paul Krugman, back when he wrote Good Economics. He had a book called Pop Internationalism, where he went after all these crazy ideas on trade theory and kind of more against the populist strains of that time. And it made so much sense the way he was arguing against what today would be popular, nationalist kind of views of trade. And then also there was a book I read called The Secrets of the Temple.
Oh gosh, yes.
That was a page turner written by a journalist. Now that book again came from left of center. I tend to be more right of center in my views, but it was a very captivating read. And of course, the author is very much coming from a labor perspective. Paul Volcker really screwed over labor, destroyed the economy. Of course, I read that book and I was like, what a hero. He made the tough choices, Now, to be clear, there was a lot of human suffering that went on. But,
of course.
My view is he definitely was the person for that time. So reading that, and finally, one last person I'll mention. I went to the University of Georgia for graduate school. Just wasn't based on, looking at rankings, just was close to home. I liked football, so I went there.
Go Dogs.
And lo and behold, who was there as a professor in the economics department? George Selgin. So George Selgin was my teacher. He was my dissertation chair. And now we often work together, we collaborate. But he was pivotal in kind of shaping my thinking about the Fed about nominal GDP targeting, about, keeping the Fed's footprint really light. So that's my story in brief.
Keeping the Fed's footprint really light. So let's focus on the Powell era. So his first day in office, I'm sure you remember, maybe you don't, the stock market fell more than 1,000 points. The Dow Jones Industrials declined more than 1,000 points. Not a peep out of him, didn't say a word. For his first congressional testimony, he was very staunch and adamant. It is not the Fed's job to backstop the stock market. Well, the stock market didn't like him saying that one bit. But he was definitely kind of the 2012 version of Jay Powell, the not PhD, the not academic, so to speak, more of the markets person in him, the former private equity. This is the man who orchestrated Salomon Brothers when it blew up, and worked with Warren Buffett to do so when he was at the Treasury Department. So a bit of a different character, a little bit more Paul Volcker in the beginning, and then maybe you can take us through what happened as 2018 progressed, because as I often reminisce, the debt of General Electric was downgraded on Halloween of that year, and that set off a daisy chain of events that culminated in what we know as the Powell pivot. So walk us through 2018, because I'm going to end with one of your more recent tweets, but that's where we're headed. But walk us through what happened in 2018 first.
So my hot take on that period was that was a continuation of the desire to normalize monetary policy. It started with Janet Yellen. They tried starting back in 2015. They got one rate hike, but they had to pace themselves. They realized, it was a very delicate situation. I think life was more complicated than simply pushing rates back up to where they had been pre-Great Financial Crisis. And I think Jay Powell kind of came in with that same mindset. He was going to finish the work that Janet Yellen had started. And so it was pretty surprising to me, actually, to hear them in 2018, I believe. You probably know the timing of this better, but I recall in 2018, they were very much talking up rate hikes, multiple rate hikes, to the extent they were willing to have an inverted yield curve. And several of them even said so outright. John Williams, Lael Brainerd, they all said, look, it's what we got to do. It's not a big deal. This time is different. They invoked that, So then comes around, we see what happens. Early 2019, things get a little volatile. Financial markets don't like what they're seeing. And Powell pivots pretty quickly. Also during this time, something else is going on, kind of lurking in the background, but informing this is their view of what is the sustainable rate of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment changes. It drifts down as they see the unemployment rate dropping and inflation not going up. They're thinking that through a Phillips curve view of inflation. That's not my preferred approach, but that's the way they think. And they're linking unemployment rate to inflation, and that they're seeing nothing happen really with inflation. They keep lowering that. They also keep lowering their long run terminal value of the federal funds rate, or they would call R-star, the neutral rate. So I think all those things are going into play. And sometime around then, I know Jay Powell comes out and says, we got our R-star wrong. We got our U-star wrong. And said, look, we definitely thought the economy was going to heat up before it did. So I think between what happened in financial markets and their reevaluating the speed limit of the economy, it made it easy to do the Powell pivot.
And so that seemed like it initially kind of put a Band-Aid on the situation in 2019. In some ways, if you can look past kind of the flash crash and the flash recession of COVID, really markets haven't looked back since. In a way, if you look at it, the 2018 episode looks a lot uglier because it's a little bit more prolonged than what happened in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. But something started to break in 2019. It culminated on my birthday that year. It was like my birthday, September 17th. It was like September the 16th that we started to hear a lot of information out of the New York Fed. And this is kind of when we walked into the not QE moment. So what was going on in funding markets at the time?
Well, again, I'll approach this from a monetary policy perspective.
Sure.
I'm sure there's a market perspective, but the way I look at it is related to what the Fed was doing with its operating system. So it it switched from what we'd call a corridor system with very few reserves to an ample reserve system or a floor system. And the idea is you basically stuff the banking system so full of reserves that they have an ample amount, and they always will. And you want to do that so that you've saturated them. You got to the point that whatever you give them in terms of reserves, they will hold. Now, the Fed, and let me step back. The arguments for doing, why did they do that? Well, implicitly, they made a switch in late 2008 when they went to QE, and they started paying interest on excess reserves. But they officially made a change, I believe, early 2019 or 2018, this ample reserve or floor system. And so this change had been in place. It required a larger Fed balance sheet, but the Fed made this statement. They wanted a larger balance sheet, so banks would have ample reserves, but they also wanted it as small as possible, ample but small as possible. So there's some tension there, yeah. They wanted to shrink it. So they were doing QT, as you know, quantitative tightening, shrinking the balance sheet. And so the way I kind of look at what happened in September 2019 is they were shrinking the balance sheet, but at the same time, there was also just a perfect storm of things coming together. The Treasury was getting a bunch of corporate tax receipts. A bunch of other kind of government funding was coming in. And what happens is when Treasury gets money on its account at the Fed, the TGA account, it takes reserves out of the banking system. So what happened is the Fed accidentally tripped or fell back into what we call a corridor system. Even though the balance sheet was still large, it got to the place where reserves were scarce. So another way of saying this, the corridor system reserves are scarce relative to demand for them. In an ample reserve system, floor system, they're abundant and there's excess. And even though the balance sheet was bigger, and it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around this, it had shrunk back because of all these things going on to a scarce reserve. Even though it was still several $1 trillion, it was at a point where there wasn't enough reserves to meet demand. And this is tied into things in the repo market as well. And which was shocking to the Fed, was shocking to me, shocking to everybody that that huge of a balance sheet wasn't big enough. And I can get into possibly why that's the case.
Well, yeah. I mean, if I could interrupt for a second, would you also speak to negative interest rates abroad and increasing currency in circulation and foreign central banks looking to park money at the Fed at the same time that you've got the balance sheet roll-off quantitative tightening going on? So there were major exogenous influences on reserves that were taking place that were not really in the Fed's control. I mean, you can't control people desiring to hold currency in circulation.
Yeah, all those things are happening too. So that's a good point. They're developing. The Fed can't control currency demand directly. It can't control foreign demand for cash. So all those things, you're right. All those, and that's why I would call it a perfect storm. And the other thing, again, I think it's hugely important during this time is the Treasury's TGA account, Treasury General Account, the Fed. And it's huge. It goes above $1 trillion, and that's a huge swing. And then it quickly goes down whenever you have these debt ceiling talks. The Treasury will fund up, then it runs it down, and it makes these big swings in the amount of reserves. And the thing is, it's hard for the Fed to predict. Now, I had a former colleague who's with us for about a year, Chris Russo, who actually worked at the New York Fed, and his job was to forecast the Treasury General Account part of the Fed's balance sheet. And he said it was incredibly hard. You had some sense because you knew there was a debt ceiling limit coming up, but the Treasury could swing that thing one way or the other, driven by politics. And the Fed, he was kind of guessing. Now, before 2008, under the previous operating system, it was always much smaller. The Treasury also used to keep most of its cash, its money in the banking system. But once we went to this new floor system and interest on reserves began to pay a fair amount to banks, it was actually cheaper. The Treasury would actually make more money parking it at the Fed than in the banking system because banks would get, short story is banks would get payments from the Fed would give less back to the Treasury would have less earnings. So the Treasury realized it made sense to park those funds at the Fed and save themselves the lost revenue from the Fed. Any event, I think the TGA is a big part of that, but all this goes back to the change in the Fed's operating system. And there's a lot of other problems about it we can get into, but I think it's a key part of the story. They accidentally fell back into a scarce reserve system. Daryl Duffy has a paper, I forget its name, but it basically makes this point that they had a world of scarce reserves relative to demand during this time, and the Fed did not mean to be there. So they quickly, as you know, reversed course and just kind of, you could argue, kick the can down the road for a later moment.
Well, they certainly, at the moment at least, and we're gonna wait to get the T-shirt because I'm loving the T-shirt, but they certainly uninverted the yield curve with not
Yes.
QE, and that was I try and explain to people that they can't look at the not QE era through a traditional conventional prism because the Fed forcibly uninverted the yield curve. It wasn't something that happened naturally because of the macroeconomic backdrop. It was very mechanistic in nature. And I think that that's a critical distinction. It was a very fragile juncture.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, the Fed now has the standing repo facility, which
That's
my
right.
hope
That's
is,
right there.
given where
That's
we
right
are,
there. Those are my next questions.
Okay. Well, it's, you know, given where we are, I mean, there's no perfect world. I would love a world where the Fed's balance sheet was much smaller. I mean, just for comparison, look north to Canada. They've had a corridor operating system, a much smaller balance sheet. Now, I haven't checked up on them recently because they did expand it during the pandemic. But during the great financial crisis, 2007, 2009, they expanded their balance sheet, but they shrunk it back down. Mm-hmm. And they have much better interest rate control. I mean, one of the reasons going to a floor ample reserve system is the argument is that it would provide better interest rate control. If banks have ample reserves, then the New York Fed doesn't have to try to guess how many reserves to put in, pull out. It's all taken care of. But what we found, that's not the case. I mean, September 2019 is a great example of that. But meanwhile, Bank of Canada seems to be doing a great job with far reserves. But standing repo facility, yeah, that's a development that I'm hopeful will help alleviate some of the pressures we saw in 2019 should they emerge again. Although I'm a little disappointed in its uptake. So Bill Nelson, who used to work at the Board of Governors, had a talk about this, a conference, and several banks mentioned they're simply not interested in participating in this facility.
Yeah, so, you're seeing the headlines cross, 0 bids. I'm like, well, 0 is a nice round number.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, so in order to make this work, and just to be clear, let me step back. The standing repo facility, you can view it as an extension of the discount window at the Fed. It's a way for banks to swap treasuries for reserves or reserves for treasuries, as well as primary dealers are automatically signed up. But banks, depository institutions, they also can apply. But I believe there's only been 2 or 3 that have actually signed up. And the problem is if banks don't start using it in normal times, then in panic times, it's going to be seen as the same thing as a discount window use. You're going to use the standing repo facility because you're in trouble. There'll be a stigma.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bill Nelson says we really need to get the Fed to encourage its use now. And part of it goes to bank regulators and bank supervisors. If you use the standing repo facility, you have to justify it. And so you need direction from the top. You need the Federal Reserve, the regulators at the top to really stress and emphasize this should be viewed as a normal part of business. Use the standing repo facility, and we haven't seen that yet. So my hopes may not be realized the next time we have a crisis unless things change dramatically.
Well, it's interesting you say that because if you're looking from the outside in, you're like, oh, they've got a fix for that. We're not going to have the Treasury freeze in overnight trading in Asia, and there's no bid on the long bond. But when you equated it to the discount window, all of a sudden a light bulb went off over my head. So that was the best thing you've done, and I immediately said stigma. I mean, it's reflexive, and I was inside the Fed for 9 years during the crisis, and we watched that window, and boy, banks just didn't want to go there because you might as well just wave the white flag and say, we're over, we're finished. So
right.
Reverse repo facility. It's seemingly there's obviously no stigma attached to it. Not that there would be, but maybe you can talk about that a little bit because theoretically, it's the two working in conjunction with one another that really gives the Fed control of its range.
there's multiple angles on this. So let's go to the one you just mentioned, interest rate control. I mean, the fact that they have to resort to this speaks to the problem that interest rate control isn't working too well with the other tools. So they had, you're right, they have a discount window at the top. In theory, interest on reserve should be the floor, the bottom, but rates were dropping below that. So they had to turn on the overnight repo facility again and use it extensively again. So it speaks to the problem. It's more than just the Fed itself. I want to be fair. I'm blaming the floor system a lot, but it has a lot to do with regulations as well. So, I mean, we have, since Dodd-Frank came out and Basel III, there's a lot of complicated requirements for banks.
Yep.
And that, again, that speaks to the importance of having good top-down, leadership, which speaks to who we have appointed the vice chair, another topic. But that is, I think, a big deal going forward. Now, another angle on the overnight reverse repo facility, when we think about QE or large-scale asset purchases, I often will first think about, okay, what's the effect on asset prices? Is it changing spreads? Is it making, stock prices go up? Is it making bond yields change? That's on the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. That mix is affecting market prices. But there's also a liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. How is the Fed funding those asset purchases? And you can think of the Fed as, relying upon, financial intermediaries, starting with banks. So banks, their reserves are parked at the Fed. Those reserves are funding those asset purchases. So now the Fed's liable, Fed has all those reserves, it's liable to the banks. But at some point, bank balance sheet capacity ran out. Banks could no longer keep up with, especially the large amount of LSAP, the QE that we did during the pandemic. So then, the Fed had to turn to money market funds. Money market funds had to provide, funding to the Fed to get those large scale asset purchases. And that probably was going to run out as well soon too. And so at some point, if you keep increasing the Fed's balance sheet through QE, through large scale asset purchases, you got to find funding. And as you run out of one funding source, you go to another. So one way to look at the overnight reverse repo facility, it was, the next funding source the Fed was using. Another angle on the overnight reverse repo facility is simply, the Fed is stuffing liquidity into the financial system. Banks don't want to hold it. At some point, they're saturated by either demand or by regulatory reasons.
Right,
and so that liquidity spilled over.
I don't think people understand very well the regulatory constraints on banks when it comes to. I mean, I understand what you're saying when you're saying their balance sheet hit capacity, but can you unpack that a tiny bit just in case people are a little bit less familiar?
So there's a number of regulations, again, that come out of like Dodd-Frank and Basel III that require banks to hold so much capital, to fund with so much capital. That's a proper way to say that. They don't hold capital, they fund with capital. But in any event, so for example, the supplemental leverage ratio is one that was in the headlines in the news. And it's a leverage ratio. And that leverage ratio is supposed to be a backup to the first capital ratio, which is risk-based. So banks use risk-based weighting. Do they fund enough capital? The problem with risk-based funding is, banks can game it. They can, buy certain assets. So the leverage ratio, which is it's supposed to be a way to make sure banks are funding with a certain amount of capital. If they fall through the first rules, they got the second one. The problem is it looks at all the assets on the Fed's balance sheet. So it looks at equity relative to or capital relative to the amount of assets. And when you include reserves as part of the bank's assets, so that equity has to be a certain percent of all your assets, and you have a lot of reserves, and particularly during pandemic or Great Recession, reserves become a big part of the bank's balance sheet. And this rule and others like it, if you're a big, globally important bank, there's something called the ESLR, which is an added requirement on top of the existing one. But anyways, bottom line is this: the more reserves you park on your balance sheet as an asset, the more equity or capital funding you got to have. And so at some point, banks are like, well, we can't expand our balance sheet anymore. It's getting too costly. It's just too much. So those regulations really did impair banks' balance sheets. So, jumping ahead briefly to March 2020, many parts of that story, but one of the stories is banks could not intermediate the increased demand for liquidity during that period because they have these rules and regulations. Same thing, before then. But the overnight reverse repo facility is tied to this in the sense that banks could only absorb, depending on how you look at this, absorb so much liquidity from the Fed, or alternatively could only fund so much of the Fed's purchases, and in part because of these regulations, and then kind of fell on money market funds to step in and try to pick up the difference.
There's a future. There is a Basel IV in the works, if I understand correctly. And are you familiar with that?
Not much more than you. I've heard about it. I'm not sure what they're trying to do, but yeah, I mean,
I think
it means well. I mean, the idea is to have a standardized, approach. With that said, I was again talking to this gentleman, Bill Nelson. He mentioned that the Basel III requirement for the supplemental leverage ratio is actually lower. The global standard is actually lower than what is in the U.S. So the U.S. actually has relatively tight standards. And as you know, right now, there's the Fed is taking comments and reviewing a change to supplemental leverage ratio so that reserves are not a part of it. In fact, as you know, during the actual pandemic, the Fed relaxed that. And what we saw, so in other words, banks didn't have to worry about having enough capital to cover those added assets in terms of reserves. When that temporary rule ended, that's when we saw balance sheet space shrink and the sudden growth in overnight reverse repo. So the supplemental leverage ratio is tied closely to the overnight, repurchase facility. So there is this link going on. So it's amazing how important not only is the plumbing of the system, but the regulations on banks' balance sheets that surround this activity.
So you tweeted out, I think, a few days ago, this time is different than 2018, 2019, which in hindsight was an unforced error from which the Fed quickly pivoted. This time their hands are tied with inflation. So what were you saying there?
Well, I was being snarky, to be honest. I have a T-shirt I made actually in 2018, 2019. I took the emblem of the Fed, probably copyrighted, but you can go to a T-shirt web page and create your own T-shirt. So I put the Fed seal on the T-shirt in the middle. And then I have the motto for the Fed 2018, 2019. And the motto was, we have the nerve to invert the curve. This one day that hit me. I was like, that's a great little rhyme. And that's what that's what they were talking up in late 2018. And so the unforced error was that they were, talking up rate hikes, which was leading to this inversion, and then they reversed. And back then they had the flexibility to do that. But this time, I don't see how they can make that same pivot and address inflation at the same time. I mean, they're kind of in a corner right now. But yeah, so now I'm just saying, look, if the Fed needs to address inflation, they're behind the curve. To be fair, I'm behind the curve too. I didn't expect inflation to last this long. But yeah, it's going to be a tough balancing act for them to get through this next year.
So when we talk, 24/7, my Twitter feed is full of the yield curve debate, and which is important, of course. Janet Yellen will tell you, most will tell you that it's the 3-month 10-year, but there's something that's very mechanical about that, because the Fed controls the 3-month rate. So until they raise interest rates, there's no way to invert that curve. So what is the best yield curve to follow, in your view?
Oh, man, that's a tough question. I know there's been a lot of work done and emphasis on the shorter end of the yield curve. So, something between now and short-term rate, maybe a month, 2 months out, and say 2 years out. If you look at that, we're a long ways from inverting. So it's actually going up. If you look at, so we know the 2-year Treasury yield is way, way high, right? And the Fed has yet to meaningfully raise the really short end. And if you look at that yield curve, it looks great. But if you take the longer one, then yeah, it is a problem. I'm going to claim some ignorance here. I will tell you that a theory that I think makes sense, and maybe it makes less sense going forward, but one of the stories for the yield curve, or let me step back. There's a debate about the yield curve. Is the yield curve merely a symptom of a recession that's coming, or does it actually cause a recession? And I'd say it's probably a bit of both. But let me tell the causal story. The causal story is that banks and other, financial intermediaries, they depend on a spread, right? They depend on funding at a low cost and then giving loans or investing at a higher return, higher interest rate. And if to the extent the Fed flattens that, and again, it's not just the Fed, I mean, markets on the long end play a role, but the Fed plays a role on the short end. But to the extent, the Fed shrinks that spread, it makes it less profitable to make loans, to provide credit to the economy, and that therefore slows economic activity. So there is an intermediation story. Now, and there's some evidence that says this is still an important channel, but the flip side of this is banks make money a lot of other ways as well. There's lots of other fees and ways, but kind of the core, causal story is inverting the yield curve makes banks less profitable, which means less credit, which means a slowdown in economic activity.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at that channel, not through the prism of the banking system, but through through the prism of yields in general, and there's $1 trillion in non-financial global debt that has to be refinanced in 2022, so in the current year. But right now, your yield to maturity across the curve makes it to where if you're coming to refinance and you're a company to the capital markets, you're going to pay up. You're going to pay more than what you're rolling over. And that's a shift.
That's a good point. Yeah. So it has even greater repercussions than just the banking system. So, yeah. And again, it just reiterates the point that the Fed is in a really tough spot right now. It's tightening financial conditions, but it's also trying to deal with inflation. And to be fair, this speaks to why it probably should have started earlier. It would have been easier maybe to start late last year. But again, I want to be fair. I didn't at the time. I was, let's be cautious. So I'm guilty as charged. Throw me in with them. So I mean, and if I could go back in time, I would definitely change my view then.
I could say that about a lot of instances in my life as well. So we're in the same boat. What are your kind of favorite macroeconomic indicators that you watch that you find to be the most prescient, the most leading? Just on a very basic, put your macroeconomics 101 hat back on, and what kind of guides your thinking about where the economy is headed?
Well, I look at like long-term interest rates, treasuries, and that usually gives me a sense of they're not entirely related to growth, but they're definitely related to outlooks. And so for a number of things, real growth, for inflation expectations. I particularly like, in terms of inflation expectations, I like the five-year forward measure. And my story for this, and I was recently criticized on Twitter for it, but I'll tell you my story for it, is that if we think of what macroeconomic policy can do, both monetary policy and fiscal policy, what can it control? It can control the trend path of inflation. So yes, the Fed can't change shipping lanes in China or cure the coronavirus, but it can affect the trend growth of inflation. So supply shocks do affect inflation, but they tend to at some point fade. But what does stay with us is the growth of government debt, government liabilities, and the Fed and Treasury both play a part in that. And if that trend path is expected to get higher, so the growth rate of the price level going to go up, we would see it in the five-year forward. Now that's a long ways out, but at 5 years out, presumably all the supply shocks have faded. Their role in inflation is gone. And so if that thing starts to go up, then we know, the market thinks the Fed's lost control, or they expect runaway deficits at an unsustainable level. And so I look at that, and right now I take some comfort in it. Now, to be fair, the markets could be wrong. They might get the forecast wrong. I don't get so worked up about like shorter term, like break evens, because they do follow oil closely and other supply shocks. Yep. But I think that's one of my measures I've been looking at lately. The other one I'll pitch, just because it's who I am, is I like looking at nominal GDP. And in particular, I look at a measure, not just the number itself, but a measure of excess or shortfalls in nominal GDP. And for me, that's a measure of what macroeconomic policy is doing. So nominal GDP is simply total dollar spending on final goods and services. So I know we really care about real GDP. That's what things we can actually eat and do and serve and provide. But nominal GDP is you think of money times velocity, kind of going old monitor school here, but it's total spending, and that's something that macro policy can control. And if it's growing too rapidly, then we know policy's been too tight. If it's growing too slow relative to trend, or however you measure, there's some neutral path for it. And right now, it's above any kind of trend or I use a measure called the nominal GDP gap. We provided at the Mercatus Center. You can check it out. But it's based on forecasts. Drawing trends is fun, but at some point trends become, I think, misleading, especially the longer you go out.
Sure.
So it's important to base, I think, on forecasts. And no matter how you slice and dice it right now, nominal GDP or total aggregate demand is above where it should be, above expectations, above trend, which tells me then that the Fed and Treasury fiscal policy have been running the economy too hot. So just stepping back, why do we have high inflation? I think it's both supply shocks and I think macro policy has been too loose.
So I'm curious because, on a fundamental level, I think one of the reasons that monetary policy has a hard time getting it right is because of the dual mandate. And they're inherently conflicting aims for the Fed. Some would say that the Fed abandoned its inflation mandate in 2021 in favor of its employment mandate. And I'm curious what your philosophy is on that change to the Federal Reserve Act in 1978, whether that's something, there's actually a bill in Congress right now to roll that back, to get rid of the employment mandate and go to where the European Central Bank is and other major central banks and have the singular focus be on minimizing inflation?
Well, I would say politically first that I think everyone's going this direction. So even the ECB recently updated its framework so that it looks at making up for past mistakes. And although it's still technically a price stability, it is implicitly accounting for the business cycle of the European economy. But other places, like you look New Zealand is one of the original pure inflation targeters. It now has a dual mandate. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not surprising we've come down this path and are likely to stay here. It's because of, democracy. People, politicians and therefore central bankers respond to the body politic. I mean, that's why we have an independent central bank, but still they get appointed. There's still heavy dose of politics, even in central bank. In fact, very heavy. We could talk about that too.
Well, you're actually, you're actually going to the next, you're literally stepping right into it.
But I think it's probably inevitable we end up something like a dual mandate. I think the best way to deal with that, though, is, again, not to sound like a broken record, but a nominal GDP target. It's one target. It's dollar based, so it's nominal. It accounts for supply shocks. So if there is a distortion on the real side, just to be real brief here, a nominal GDP target. Imagine the Fed keeps demand on a stable path. Okay. Well, what would happen if there's a supply shock? Supply shock would temporarily raise inflation and lower real GDP. Nominal GDP, the sum of both of those would stay the same. So what it does, it allows the Fed to see through supply shocks, but also keeps the Fed making sure demand's not growing too fast or too slow. That's my proposed solution to this. It's going to be here, stick to a nominal target. But yes, clearly the average inflation targeting framework really put more emphasis on the maximum employment side of the mandate.
It did, and I'm curious. I'm curious about your views, if you can go back to your days at Treasury, of the now close links between the Fed and Treasury. And I'm wondering if you think that at some point in our future that there'll be another 1951 Federal Reserve Treasury Accord, and whether or not there'll be another kind of formalized separation of the two to be very explicit that the Fed is an independent institution.
Well, I think that is an important issue. I mean, two points on that. First, I worry about the Fed's large balance sheet, not just because it's, the footprint in the economy. It's, we talked about overnight reverse repo facility. I mean, one implication of that is the Fed's becoming a bigger and bigger part of the repo market. It's the biggest counterparty, and I find that troubling. But, another point about this is that the Fed's, going back to the liability side of its balance sheet, it's becoming a bigger and bigger public debt manager. That's the Treasury's job. But if you add up all the liabilities on the Fed's balance sheet, so add up all the reserves, so they're about 3.8 trillion now. It was about 4 trillion, and then overnight reverse repo is about 1.7. If we round up 4 and 2, we're close to 6, just under 6 trillion in government liabilities that the Fed is managing. So, I haven't looked at the recent numbers, but the total Treasury debt is 22 trillion, 23, the marketable portion. And the Fed is, managing 6 trillion of that. That's a huge amount that they should, that should not be the Fed's purview. That is definitely something Treasury. So there's been proposals to find ways to move those liabilities back to the Treasury. And I think that's important because, as you know, when the Fed manages 6 trillion worth of liabilities, it's affecting the structure of the government debt. The average duration, that's all affected by the Fed, and 6 trillion is a good chunk of that. And that's we have delegated that authority to Treasury, not the Fed. So I worry. I do think it's important. Maybe it'd be a little bit of different of a Treasury Accord, but that'd be one point. The other part is just politics are creeping into the Fed, and they feel increased pressure. In fact, I was just talking to someone who worked at the Fed for many years, and they have friends inside the Fed, and they said, "Look, we spend so much time on progressive agenda items and far less time on macroeconomic analysis." So I'll let me give my one that really, is going to make me unpopular with the left here. But let me give a good example: climate change. Now, I believe it's a real issue, but I believe Congress is the entity and other government agencies to deal with the EPA, but Congress in particular. The Fed is not going to be a very good EPA, supercharged EPA, but there's more and more pressure for it to do something. It already has 2 committees looking at climate change. One of them's called, I'll just describe. One of them is dealing with kind of the effect on banks, locally. Then there's more of a systematic review of the policy. And the Fed recently joined this network of central bankers for a greening of central banks. And again, I think climate change is a real risk. Yes, it may affect asset values down the road, but this war with Russia, right? Not us, but the Russia-Ukraine war should be a stark reminder. There's plenty of risk out there that we don't know is going to happen. I mean, the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, we could have an asteroid hit. There's slow-moving disaster, or population growth decline. All these things could affect asset values, but we don't single them out. But we do single out climate change. And I just think singling out one area because it's politically expedient to do so is going to undermine the Fed's independence. Paul Tucker, former central banker from the Bank of England, I don't know if you ever interacted with him in your days at the Fed, but he has this great tome on Fed central bank independence. And he makes the point, which I find very, convincing, and I try to apply it in my thinking. And that is, if Congress, or in his case, Parliament's going to delegate authority to an agency, that agency needs to, on a particular issue, that agency needs to apply it in a way that there's consensus in the body politic. So, for example, Congress has delegated to the Fed price stability. Most Americans agree on price stability, right? Most Americans would agree that's an important goal. America is divided on climate change. Now, maybe I don't know what most Americans believe about climate change, but the response to climate change, very divisive issue. Sure. And and Paul's point is, if you have an agency deal with a very divisive issue, it's going to undermine its independence. And I worry that this is going to backfire. I mean, right now it's climate change. Will Republicans take over? Is it going to be, funding the wall? I mean, it's going to swing one direction to the other, and that's going to make it less of a technocratic, independent institution.
Well, so at some point, you have to recognize the elephant in the room, which I think that so few people understand and appreciate, and it came out in your most recent podcast, and that is what I called in Fed Up, which, in the book that I wrote, what I called the MIT Mafia, and that is the staff at the Federal Reserve Board and how much power they exert over the ability to stand up and say, no, wait, we're going in the wrong direction. We need to be independent. Leadership needs a voice, whether you're talking about people on the board being kind of overwhelmed by the staffers, or if you're talking about district bank presidents who are even more marginalized. But it seems like the staff increasingly is dictating the dialogue and in the background pushing the Fed to be more political.
I've got the impression that's less the case. Now, I may be wrong. Let me give you some reasons for hope here. So I know when Jay Powell came in, you know Jay Powell, he's kind of an aw shucks kind of guy, very disarming personality. But there was an article or two written about how he disempowered the barons at the Board of Governors. There were these gatekeepers, the chiefs of each section. You could only, as an economist, you could only go through them. And he kind of said, no, we're going to stop that. So I think that's a refreshing change. The other thing, again, going back to that little anecdote I was telling you, that story, there are many Fed staffers on the inside who feel the pressure from the woke progressive. They want to do macroeconomic analysis. In fact, I had someone on the show, you might like their paper, Carla Binder, she's at Haverford College, and then Christina Paragon Skinner, she's at Wharton, University of Pennsylvania. Christina is a law professor and Carla is an economics professor, but they have a paper they did where they went out and they tracked, past few decades of research from the regional banks. And this is, I think, motivated by Senator Toomey's concern about the regional banks are getting real progressive and woke. So they track their research and really fascinating. If you go to their paper, they show these charts of the amount of research, the share of research being dedicated to like inequality, climate change, I forget, a few other progressive agendas. And it's an increasing share of the research output. So which means there's less being done on traditional macro topics.
Right.
So, I mean, there probably is still some of what you're saying, but I would just say that I think Powell's been good, at least from that perspective. And then I would also say the staff themselves are feeling the pressure that this politicized environment. So,
well, that's actually refreshing to hear. One of my mentors inside the Fed was a guy by the name of Harvey Rosenblum. He was at the Fed for 40 years. He was the director of research under Richard Fisher. And as he was retiring after 40 years, he'd started out in Chicago. I said, what's your main takeaway? And he said, well, I wish that I would have guided my PhD staff to do more research on monetary policy. And I went,
wow.
I don't understand. And he said, well, for a lot of them, they go off and do the research that they want to do, regardless of the fact that they're in an institution that is mandated to safeguard the economy with monetary policy. I had heard about Powell and the Barrons. Given who your favorite person is, somebody relayed to me recently that Paul Volcker used to make the staff sit down at seminars that explained why the Phillips curve was bunk. So I had to share that with you. But he made
Very
the staff.
interesting, yeah.
This is many, many, many moons ago.
Yeah.
But on that note, who is your favorite Fed chair in history? I'm curious.
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. I'll go, even though, things haven't gone perfectly, I'd probably have Powell and Volcker tied. I think both of them have gone through an excruciating very tough challenges. They've been through a lot. What I like about Powell is that he has some humility about him. He's also very politically smart. So he had this statement, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that he was going to wear out the carpets in Capitol Hill as soon as he became, which is brilliant. I mean, with all respect to Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, they're academics, right?
Yep.
They met with people, but Powell understood the importance. And that's why he could survive both Democrats and Republicans. When Trump was after him or when Elizabeth Warren's after him, he had a base of support.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, it's a matter of public record. His daytimer. I mean, no Fed chair has been up the hill as much as Powell.
And I think, given we went through the pandemic, what we're doing now, I mean, there's definitely some decisions I would disagrey on, but I think, given the alternatives, given where we could be, I think he's done relatively well. But Paul Volcker obviously is the one who changed the direction of the economy. I mean, I think fiscal policy played a role too. There were tax reforms and stuff in the 1980s that were important as well. But Paul Volcker was a sheer force of personality, and that has to be admired.
We know that Powell is going to get reconfirmed handily. My question is, Senator Shelby recently asked him pointedly, are you willing, as Paul Volcker was, are you willing to put the United States economy into a recession? And Powell can't run around and claim that the world is burning down. It's his job to not do that. I get that. But when asked that pointed of a question, he said, I hope when history writes the books, the answer is yes. And I thought that was a very curious, I mean, I was proud that he said it. But do you think that he has an inner Volcker? Do you think he can put the U.S. economy into recession to get inflation? Even if it's just, I mean, we're seeing, to your point, we're seeing unloading times at the docks come way off. We're seeing activity at the ports come way down. The supply chain disruption is being undisrupted. Delivery times are coming way down. So a lot of things that were said to have been transitory are passing through.
Yeah.
That being said, we know that housing inflation is acting with a very long lag, and that there are exogenous sources of inflation right now that have really complicated matters. But do you think Powell can put the U.S. economy into a recession?
I think he will if necessary. I think, before, even as late as 2021, 2020 for sure, the Fed was still worried about what had happened in the past decade, which is low inflation, low rates. And in some sense, we all do this. We fight the last battle. I mean, but now the last battle is time to refight, the 1970s concern. So I think he will. It's not going to be easy, but just the amount of political pressure. I mean, who would have thought a few years ago that inflation would be such a salient political issue, right? I mean, it's going to kill the Democrats here in the fall. It's killing Biden's approval rating. Mm-hmm. It's in some ways it's a good check. I mean, I'll lay my cards on the table. I think in some ways this is a healthy dose of medicine to remind us that the world doesn't operate according to MMT. This is
amen to that.
Well, this is a they've gone awfully quiet now that inflation is really high, but I think we go through generational swings where we forget what happened in the past. Now, let me be very clear. I like the Fed's new framework. I think it was taken to an extreme, which has led to this inflation, but it had the ability to deal with low inflation, like if we have that again, I think is useful. For me, the struggle with the framework is it's still an inflation target based, and it's so confusing. Like right now, we're seeing as inflation caused by supply side or demand side. What we care about is demand. Is the Fed creating too much demand? And again, going back to nominal GDP targeting, that's why I wish the Fed would go down there. In fact, I think 2025, the Fed's having another review. They're going to update their framework, and I'm hoping that they'll move closer to nominal GDP targeting. But I guess going back to your question, I'm taking a long way there, but the idea that Powell will do what's necessary, I think he will. I think he's pragmatic. He still, as you know, wants to engineer a soft landing, but I just think that's harder and harder by the day.
I think the discussion has shifted because of Russia, Ukraine, but you already saw confidence coming down prior to that moment as it is, and now we have confidence at the lowest level in more than a decade. So let's talk about the head of bank supervision. Let's talk about the tradition, because I think that this is underappreciated. When you have a cabinet appointee as a president, it's kind of copacetic to have a party line vote. You can go 50-50 for somebody in your cabinet because they're political appointees. Tradition has it that that is not the case with Federal Reserve officials, with governors. And yet we look back, we see that Brainerd had 63 votes and that Yellen was the only one that came closer to the line with 56 votes in the Senate. And they're both political animals, the both of them. But do you think that Fed appointees, that Fed nominees should be held to a higher standard than cabinet appointees when it comes to getting a consensus vote in Congress because they are supposed to be apolitical individuals who join the board? I know that was a really easy question, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, let me answer it this way. I think the Fed, the nomination process for the Fed is simply succumbing to the same politicization forces that we see everywhere else. And, if you're going to, again, put someone on the Fed and that person has a strong view on an issue that roughly evenly divides the country, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, this is not the good old days. You're right. There was more civility, but in general, politics is less polarized. We live in a different environment, different era. And I think Biden, if he were smart, would pick someone who was less controversial. I mean, he's had two big nominations, burned on him, right? Salah Omarova and then Sarah Bloom Raskin. So both of them were perceived, whether fairly or not, they were perceived as, more radical choices. And, Biden needs to pick someone he's a Democrat, but they're pragmatic, just left of center. Yep. Otherwise, this is going to keep happening. And, it didn't help that the Democrats kind of poisoned the well over at the FDIC. The appointees over there. And I remember talking to some friends who are on left of center on Twitter. I was like, you're going to come to regret this. Like, oh, no, it was necessary. We got to make change now. I'm like, there are norms out there for a reason. Yep. We want to preserve institutional, integrity. And doing that kind of short-sighted, reshuffling of power is just. But again, that's par for course. I mean, things have been going that direction, so maybe we shouldn't be surprised. But if you're if you're a president, the smart thing to realize is it's going to be a bloody process. So pick someone, who can make it through that bloody process, not someone who's going to be perceived as radical.
And just as an aside, I've never seen so many candidates trying to be pushed through together. It's just unheard of.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
In the beginning, it was like buy one, get four free. I was like, what? I just don't understand this. And I will tell you that Pat Toomey is one of my favorite people in the world because he respects term limits. And one man has been able to do so much. Something else that he insisted on doing, and I'm curious your view on this, is he insisted with the final stimulus package that President Trump signed into law, he insisted that the Treasury's off-balance sheet vehicles for credit, and he was aiming mainly at the municipal bond one, but that they'd be switched off, but that they could not be switched back on unless there was a new, unusual, exigent, a new kind of emergency, that whoever the next Treasury Secretary was wouldn't just be able to flip a switch in the event that there was. I mean, you've seen the MOVE Index, as I have. The MOVE Index is telling you that there's credit risk bubbling up in the system. Well, in response to that, the law says, because of Toomey, the law says that Janet Yellen cannot just flip the switch back on. So it comes back to it's a parallel to the standing repo facility and the stigmatization. Can the Fed engineer again, especially without fiscal authorities helping them and all the stimulus spending? What happens in credit? And this is similar to, will Powell put the economy into recession? What happens if you can't turn those facilities back on at Treasury, which I personally don't think should exist as a matter of public record?
Well, I agree with your concern about all these off-balance sheet entities. I mean, I think Congress should decide, ahead of time. Now, this is, again, probably asking too much of Congress. But in theory, Congress should say, hey, here's a law which says this authority turns on when X happens, or we're going to empower the Fed with, very clearly thought out, set of tools that can be almost like an automatic stabilizer for liquidity support when certain conditions are met. That should be something Congress should create. I mean, during the Great Depression, Congress created their Refinance Corporation, which kind of it was a fiscal authority outside of the Fed that was empowered to try to save some banks in a productive manner. Now, that's the kind of direction I would prefer. It's explicitly, a law by Congress. With that said, the U.S. has a rich history of doing off-balance sheet activity. I mean, when 2020 was unfolding, I'm like, man, looking at all these facilities, and some of the facilities I support, but some of them were clearly credit facilities. And I said, I was like, Congress is effectively pushing its responsibility onto the Fed to do more and more, and it's off balance sheet, so it doesn't get reflected in budget numbers. And then someone reminded me, said, David, take a deep breath. We've been doing this for years with the GSEs. I mean, it's nothing new. It's the easy, politically expedient thing to do, which is a fair point. With that said, so what could the Fed do in a crisis going forward? I mean, other than growling back to Congress, the Fed still has other facilities that maybe indirectly could support, that particular market. And the Fed can still invoke 13.3 powers and invoke some of the facilities it has. I think if there were a challenge, I guess, to invoking those, would be more the impact it has on the Fed's balance. The Fed's balance sheet is so large already.
Right.
What happens when it gets bigger? And for the things we talked about, who's going to be funding? Our money market fund's going to step in. Banks going to step in. Who's next? Our corporate treasurer's going to step in and fund. I mean, which would mean then the Fed would start maybe buying directly in corporate markets. So there's a whole interesting a separate conversation. What does it mean to have a neutral footprint in terms of asset purchases? If I might just add real quick on this point. So in the US and in the UK, the view is the Fed should only buy treasuries because you're just swapping one government liability for another. From the consolidated government balance perspective, it's a wash. So that's neutral. In Europe, however, they would say, no. You're still supporting government debt, disproportionately supporting government debt, which is going to affect its price relative to other assets. So you're not being very neutral. So what the German model, which influences the ECB, is the central bank should actually buy a basket of assets that's representative of whatever a typical investor holds, so that just imagine, I know that's not such a thing as a typical investor, but just imagine on average, there's this typical investor. You want to mimic that basket that they hold so that you're having less distortions. And that's the European model, but we have the US, UK model here.
We do, and we have a massive footprint, basically, that is credit easing in the mortgage-backed securities market.
Yeah.
And if I could ask you, just to make my Twitter followers calm down, the Fed is not growing its balance sheet anymore. And I get this all the time. I'm like, mortgage-backed securities take a long time to settle. They're not, and yet people are watching the weekly reports so closely. But I think that it's important for people like you to kind of distill the conspiracy theories. Quantitative tightening, when it happens, we're going to know.
Yeah. The Fed has over $1 trillion in Treasury liabilities. I haven't checked mortgage-backed securities, but over $1 trillion in Treasury liabilities that will mature within a year. So if the Fed did nothing, if it allowed assets to passively roll off, it could shrink pretty quickly. Will it do that? We'll see. So, on one hand, what effect does QE have? Does large-scale asset purchases have? As I alluded to earlier, there's this academic theory which says it shouldn't make that much difference, other than maybe a signaling channel. I'm not a big supporter, at least in theory, of the portfolio balance channel, but there is a signaling channel. I acknowledge that. But then when you look at the plumbing side, then I think it does matter immensely. As we talked about, the plumbing of the Fed's operations behind QE, I think, are more important than maybe some of the other things we typically look at when we think about QE.
One of the other pleas that I get constantly on my feed is, why doesn't the Fed just sell long maturity bonds off of its balance sheet? And it's hard to explain, but the idea is kind of Voldemort within the Federal Reserve System. It's just not done. So maybe you could unpack that just a tiny bit, and then we'll round up.
Well, if we step back and look, say, pre-2008, the Fed's balance sheet does permanently grow over time. So as you alluded to, you mentioned earlier, there's currency demand that's going to grow. There's bank reserves. As the economy grows, the Fed's balance sheet has to permanently get larger just to stay normal, just to avoid, Now, of course, we're way beyond that, but that's something to keep in mind, that you want to actually, some of that you want to keep. So let me step back. Post 2008, the Fed was shrinking its balance sheet, and as you mentioned, some of that balance sheet switched from reserves into currency, and at that point, the horse is out the barn. That's the reality of life. So we couldn't shrink it back to pre-2008 values. And there's a big difference now. To be fair, the Fed's balance sheet now is close to $9 trillion. It was $4 trillion before. So I think there is some reduction that needs to be done. But the Fed is going to be hesitant to move aggressively, maybe legitimately, given plumbing issues, given the signaling channel. But I do think they are eager to shrink for one reason we haven't touched on, I think might be important here, and that's the political economy, or the politics of the Fed's balance sheet. And I think this is going to be a big deal going forward. And I think this might be, if anything, the biggest kind of motivation. And I'm speculating here, but I would say an important motivation. And that is, think of that $6 trillion we talked about, almost $6 trillion in liabilities, bank reserves and overnight reverse repo facilities. Those earn interest to banks, to money market funds. Now, if rates do start to go up, as markets are predicting, think how big of the payments banks are going to get, and money market funds are going to, and GSEs are going to get from the Fed. And think how that's going to play out politically. I can imagine Elizabeth Warren just losing herself over there. Yes, as well as it's a bad image. Now, technically, if banks and money market funds are getting paid the same rate they would get at Treasury, it's not fundamentally different. They're just holding Fed liabilities. But if the rate is higher than, say, Treasuries are offering, it is indeed a subsidy to them. But no matter what it is, at the end of the day, it looks awful.
Oh yeah.
And it just opens up the Fed's balance sheet as an attractive piggy bank. In general, the Fed's balance sheet seems to be a free lunch. We can tap it and do things. And that's
in the
my
end,
worry.
In the end, J.P. Morgan Chase. That was a major line item in their on their profit statement. It was just IOER, and you're right. The optics are very damning. They're toxic. Yeah.
So I think they know this, and they need to. They want to shrink because $9 trillion. Again, $6 trillion in terms of like liabilities you have to pay, but it's going to get intense pretty soon if they don't shrink it meaningfully. Even that $4 trillion. It's rates start going up. It's the same discussion on federal debt. Federal debt rates go up, bigger interest payments.
Sure.
Same thing with the Fed, smaller number, but just as poor in terms of optics.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Well, before I let you go, I have to say now I understand, because you told me that you started off your life as a child of missionaries. Now I understand why you have a Bible verse on your Twitter feed. And
yes.
My mother always guides me to a particular psalm. So you've got Micah on yours, but I just have to say now I kind of get it. When did you come back to the States? I'm curious.
Well, I'll date myself here, but I came back in 1982.
Okay.
So we were there from 1976 to 1982. So I lived through, in fact, we lived in South Africa. I lived through apartheid. Wow. And my dad actually worked for a church that itself was divided because of apartheid in South Africa. So my dad actually his work was to work with, the black South Africans, but he traveled over other parts of Africa too. So it was a real, just as a kid, and I was really young back then, I was very aware things were messed up over there. Come back to the US, things are better. What does it take to change?
Well, exactly. And I'm going to keep the verse pulled up and share it with my mother, she's a great study of the Bible. And I will hope that maybe in a year's time we can come back together and revisit what the plumbing looks like, on the other side of the beginning of this massive Fed campaign.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Hopefully no recession between now and then, but maybe.
We will see. We will see. You know what? We'll see which curve was right. Let's put it that way.
So, there you go.
And you should I'll send you a copy of my book. You send me a T-shirt. How's that?
Okay. Sounds
Thank
good.
you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on your show.